Hey folks, if you're here for an in-depth look at indies, you're in the right place. As for today, I'm going to be taking a gander at the recently released Stories from the Outbreak, a strategic turn-based roguelite by Coldwile Games. Admittedly, the game's still in early access, so there's feasibly a fair bit that can change, even over the course of their currently estimated 3 months. Still, that begs the question, did the current content leave me feeling like this could become a breakout hit, or was this story dead on its feet? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. Anyways, given this is a first look, I'll keep this simple. Premise-wise, the city of Riga has fallen to a plague known as the New Death. Standard zombie apocalypse stuff, really. Your part of this is to control a random group of survivors and clear a path through the city in order to reach the last ferry leaving, provided you can pay the toll. As far as its current execution, it's decent. The tutorial serves to set the overall mood of the game, and the overarching setting is slowly fleshed out through some well-written prose during the events you encounter during a run, which makes them feel a bit more rewarding. On a smaller scale, there's also some collectible notes you can acquire across your various runs, though their relatively bite-sized nature mostly makes them feel like flavor. That is, besides the character-specific entries, or rather, entry. See, while you do get an unlockable chunk of background story for a character and flavor for the world, it's specifically tied to a single character currently, Janice, one of the 2 tutorial ones, and requires you to repeatedly clear out playthroughs using him in order to advance his progress and earn all of those story segments. Admittedly, he's a decent tank, but yeah, it's a bit weird that such a comparatively large amount of lore is locked behind a single character and none of the others have received a similar amount of attention. Yet. Though on the subject of nitpicks, I'm actually going to double back to the events. See, while the existing ones are fun enough, the actual pool still feels fairly small to the point that encountering the same ones in a given run, possibly even 3 times, isn't impossible, and some of them you'll wind up seeing quite frequently. Sure, it means it's easier to explore all the options, but at the same time it does make the world feel a bit smaller, both narratively and mechanically. Which, yeah, let's get into the nuts and bolts of this whole thing, shall we? At the end of the day, Stories from the Outbreak is a very combat-focused roguelite which sees you entering a near-continuous string of turn-based RPG battles, with a, distinct focus on difficulty, since even the most basic encounters will make a sizable dent on you if you're ill-prepared. See, while there's a pretty decent array of characters that you can recruit, the core of your team will always be built around some form of tank due to the way combat works. See, most of your character's damage capacity is fairly low to begin with, and once you're past the initial few enemies, you'll rapidly start to encounter constant formations of beefy enemies. While in and of itself this would be likely enough to whittle through non-tanks' armor reserves and into their precious health, it's then compounded by the focus system. Essentially, whenever an enemy has a turn, they gain between 1 to 2 focus, scaling up their damage accordingly. What's more, every 4 focus they gain provides them a buff, such as major damage upgrades, buffing other enemies, or even adjusting their speed so they can barrage you even harder and gain focus even faster in a horrible feedback loop of pain. Like, yes, you get focus as well and even character-specific focus buffs, but without a solid frontline, you can expect to get mulched in fast. And hell, even if you do manage to limp through a few fights, the simple fact of the matter is that your recovery options for health feel fairly limited, whether it's a rare character's tiny heals, a tile with a healing event, which might not even be consistent, or a day's rest. And resting isn't even a guarantee either, since not only are there limited points to do so at, it requires a hefty amount of food, especially if you've acquired a lot of characters without losing anyone, and that's just to break even. If you factor in that many food gaining events aren't guaranteed, that you'll lose current health if you don't have enough, you're sometimes just at the mercy of RNG as to whether you can even risk recovering versus sustaining your meager status quo. It's brutal and really reinforces a general emphasis on playing smart, being extremely mindful of how far back on the action timeline a given move will place you and leave you vulnerable, figuring out the most dangerous enemies for prolonged fights, and how to best arrange the characters you've currently found. Incidentally, this is also where the game's meta progression kicks in, at least such as it is. First off, while you initially only have access to 2 starting characters, as you recruit characters along your journey, clear fights with them, and choose them as the character to take the ferry at the end, they'll gain progress towards being unlocked as a viable pick when starting a run. The freedom to at least pick one at least ensures you're always able to have a tank in your loadout. As for the other half of the meta progression, after you've unlocked a character, you'll unlock more of their moveset. Normally, you'd have to rely on random characters to unlock their abilities as you clear fights, but if you max out a character's progress, they'll have their full basic loadout, which helps immensely towards how much they can contribute in a fight. It also means you'll be able to consistently earn the side grade / upgrades for their abilities whenever a character actually gets a move upgrade. Though, yeah, I'll admit the character progression feels a bit weird and bad. Because during a run, it's not necessarily the characters in your active party who are progressing. It'll just pick someone random to give a new ability or to potentially push an upgrade on it, and if you don't want or have no interest in the character, there's no way to redirect it to someone else. Same with the very limited stat boost you gain during a run. All very arbitrary. In fact, this arbitrary advancement element also applies to the mood system as well. Sure, these ones actually do apply to the characters you're using, but they are essentially stat modifiers that randomly crop up and provide a bonus and penalty to one of your stats, potentially screwing up a character. Yeah. It all just feels so random. If you happen to have a large roster of characters, it can feel very punishing. Oh, and those idle characters you have kicking around soaking upgrades, while you can exchange them for someone else in your formation, I didn't often do so, as characters tended to either be very alive or suddenly dead. So mostly, I just see them if everyone in my party wiped, and whatever random assortment of dudes spilled out into the remnants of the fight, unprepared and in a random formation. It would be sort of nice if you had the ability to set up a backup roster if you're going to do this like that. Hint, hint. Hint, hint, hint. But yeah, that's the combat side of things. So what about the exploration? Those choices you may see insofar as navigating the map. It's alright. It actually took me a couple runs to notice, but the actual layout of the maps doesn't really seem to change. You can find similar fuel reserves, fights, events, resting points, etc., etc. Like, yes, the actual content of the fight, event tile, or the like will change between runs, but overall you can probably set a relatively stable course from game to game without thinking too hard on it currently. As for your objectives itself, well, overall, fuel is nice as both a currency to get food or certain events, and every 3 lets you evacuate a character when you clear the game, and thus advance their meta tracks considerably. Food is also another obvious perk unless you have some really good healing going on and don't care about starvation. Beyond that, it's mostly whether you want to gamble on fights, with the harder ones giving better rewards like skills, stats, and relics, or events, which can range from stat checks as a party, as individual characters, or events like the arena. I actually really love the arena event. It's brutally hard as far as they go, but it's so memorable, especially as sparse as the actual pool is. And as it currently stands, the variety in things still feels fairly low. Again, it's not uncommon to get the same events several runs in a row or even in the same run. Like, sure, it's neat to explore some of the events with different options and to see the different outcomes, but so many just culminate in yet another fight or relatively similar outcomes so long as you succeed. I don't know. But yeah, that was the gameplay as it is currently, so let's get into the graphics, and as an overarching thing in regards to both the visuals and the audio, I think it's decent. I like the character animations, there's an alright array of enemies, and the boss designs are adequately fun, even if the last boss is just a silly wiggly boy. I mean, tactically, he is a time, but animation-wise, he is a silly wiggly boy. That said, I do have some gripes that I reserved for this situation, and they are essentially all information presentation, so strap in. First off, there is a lot of information you don't see with characters on the starting screen. It would be really nice to see what abilities a character currently has access to, so you have a good idea of their capabilities. Second, both for the starting screen and in-game, I'd really like an idea of what the abilities upgraded into. So I know if I want to tactically take a character behind a shed and get them murdered by zombie lassie, since we can't just set them loose in the wild or ditch them at a shelter, and it'd be really good if they weren't just sitting there soaking up my precious ability upgrades. Secondly, it'd be really nice to be able to see what focus abilities a character has access to when they're out of a fight. I mean, like, at all. I don't know why this information isn't in the game, since my memory is potatoes, and I just love to be able to have a clear reminder so I can see who synergizes with who. Thirdly, it'd be nice to see how far along a character is on their meta progression track. Currently, the only time you get to see this is during the game's end credits. This should be on the character select screen. Please. But yeah, let's bring this to a close, shall we? And while I did have my nitpicks, I did ultimately put 14.5 hours into this game. On the other hand, I do feel like I've seen the crux of what it has to offer at this juncture after having cleared it a decent handful of times, unlocking all the characters, and maxing out a handful. What I mean by this is, as a roguelite, the replayability could definitely use some work. Some more enemy variety, events, map layout, and even some potential boss variants, since the 3 you encounter are always the same. Heck, there is a hostile human death cult. I'd love to see some representation from them. That said, it wasn't just a matter of the layouts either. At the moment, team composition really does feel similar, especially due to how reliant you are on tanks. I frequently found myself hinging my strategy on one of 2 particular characters, if not both, for my survivability. Everyone else simply didn't measure up efficiency-wise. Though, I'll admit that I felt I had substantially more leeway when it came to tinkering with the offensive and strategic side of things. Still, as far as clearing things, well, there isn't much in the way of different endings to unlock, as even the epilogue is mostly just a summary of how your current playthrough went down, win or lose. Essentially, it's an experience that is fun, but flawed and somewhat limited, and I'll admit that I'm fairly hopeful for what the future will bring, since the developers have come out and said that their early access plans are built around better fleshing out character dynamic and relationships, adding specific personal goals for the characters to do, and just overall variety. I'll be keeping my eye out on this title, to say the least. And hey, if you folks want to see a return review for this when it hits full release, you can always let me know in the comments. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreons. You can get a nice little preview of the episodes that aren't currently released on YouTube, and also just support me and Hop. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.